Welcome back to another weekly space rundown, and we have lots to cover once again, from continued progress at Starbase as SpaceX work towards the next Starship orbital flight test, with the Flight 7 Super Heavy booster undergoing static fire earlier today, to 4 Falcon 9 launches, one of which completed the first shell of its Starlink direct-to-cell constellation. Beyond SpaceX, China conducted 3 launches, which included the first flight of the Kuaizhou 1A Pro and the 100th flight of Long March 3B. Europe's VEGA C returned to flight after a 2-year hiatus. The Iranian Space Agency delivered a spacetug and 2 cubesats to orbit, and we had missions from India and Russia as well. All of this and so much more, including the imminent maiden flight of New Glenn and news regarding the issues with Artemis I's heat shield. So settle back and enjoy. Starship Flight 7 is going to be an amazing way to start off 2025, with SpaceX currently aiming for a launch on the 11th of January, with Ship 33, the first Block 2 upper stage, and Booster 14, a Block 1 Super Heavy. Until last week, the only tests either of these vehicles had undergone were cryo loads, with both vehicles undergoing these tests in October. But things are about to change on Thursday, when we saw the rollout of Super Heavy Booster 14 being transported from Mega Bay 1 down to the Starbase Orbital Launch Complex for static fire testing. It was promptly lifted onto the launch mount by the chopsticks, and then all we had to do was wait. First up, we saw a spin prime test on the 7th. This is essentially a static fire test, but without the fire. The engines are spun up as if they were going to actually light, but then the test ends prior to actual ignition. Then, the stage was set. Earlier today, in the light of a beautiful Texan morning, SpaceX began loading propellant onto the vehicle, which you can see signified by the formation of ice along its fuselage. And then, the time came. We first up saw the FireX detonation suppression system appear underneath the vehicle. We then saw the water deluge system activate, and then, wait for it, we then had successful ignition of the Raptor 2 engines, letting this booster roar for the first time. Hopefully we get an official SpaceX drone shot shared at some point in the next few days, as those are always really cool to see. What's next for Booster 14? Well, it'll need to return to the build yard at some stage before Flight 7, so it can have its hot stage ring installed, but then I guess that's about it. Before all the static fire excitement took place, and before Booster 14's rollout, we did see SpaceX conduct some preparations down at the launch pad, with purging of both the booster quick disconnect and the Raptor engine quick disconnect. This is basically just SpaceX blasting gas through the lines to eject any contaminants ahead of the booster testing. We also saw lots of work with Orbital Launch Pad B, with the delivery of containers and just general groundwork, as well as continued work to Pad B's orbital launch mount. SpaceX aren't letting Starship development slow down the crazy cadence of Falcon 9's launches. We saw 4 launches last week alone, 3 of which were Starlink missions, launching on Wednesday, Thursday and Sunday. I usually cover these together since they're all the same sort of thing, but this time they all had things about them that made them interesting in their own way. Wednesday's Starlink launch was a pretty standard affair of 24 satellites being launched to space from Pad 40 at Cape Canaveral, but this launch was pretty amazing because this was the first time SpaceX launched a Falcon 9 first stage booster for the 24th time. B1067 is now our best hope yet for seeing 25 launches and landings from a single Falcon booster. Following stage separation, the booster made its historic 24th landing on the Assured Fall of Gravitas drone ship stationed in the Atlantic Ocean. Moving on to Thursday's launch, this time the rocket launched from Space Launch Complex 4 East at the Vandenberg Space Force Base, carrying 20 Starlink satellites, 13 of which sporting direct-to-cell capabilities, which connected over laser backhaul to the Starlink constellation, eliminating all dead zones and completing the first orbital shell of the Starlink direct-to-cell constellation. Falcon 9's first stage landed on the Of Course I Still Love You drone ship after stage separation, completing its 12th mission and also SpaceX's 350th flight with a flight-proven booster. The third and final Starlink mission was on Sunday and saw the rocket carry 23 Starlink satellites to orbit from Cape Canaveral Pad 40, including 13 with direct-to-cell capabilities to begin the next phase of Starlink direct-to-cell. The touchdown of the first stage on the Assured Fall of Gravitas drone ship marked this booster's second overall landing. There was one other Falcon 9 mission last week. This was on Thursday, and it carried a replacement for the partly failed SXM-7 satellite operated by SiriusXM, an American broadcasting company that provides radio services to the US. The replacement satellite was called the SXM-9, and the Falcon 9 successfully delivered it to geostationary transfer orbit from Cape Canaveral Launch Pad 39A. The Falcon's first stage landed on the Just Read the Instructions drone ship, marking the 100th time this drone ship has supported a booster landing, and the 19th landing for this particular Falcon 9 first stage. After a 2-year grounding following a launch failure in 2022, Europe's VEGA C rocket returned to flight last Thursday. The previous launch failure was due to a nozzle issue with its motor, which required a redesign. Thursday's launch was preceded by several delays due to electrical checks and a mechanical issue with its mobile gantry, but eventually everything was ready and the rocket lifted off successfully from Europe's spaceport in French Guiana, carrying the Sentinel-1C Earth observation satellite to low Earth orbit to provide high-resolution radar imagery for environmental monitoring and maritime traffic detection. The success of the launch is a big step in Europe regaining independent access to space. They used to operate Soyuz rockets, but following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, they lost access to these vehicles. Competition in space is always a good thing, and while Arianespace is unfortunately still firmly rooted in the old space mentality for now, it's always great to see more rockets flying. I hope to see Europe eventually catch up to the steps being taken by US providers like SpaceX, Blue Origin and Rocket Lab USA. 2 European satellites were launched by an Indian polar satellite launch vehicle from the Satish Dhawan Space Center. You know how this goes by now, but YouTubers frequently get hit by copyright strikes for showing Indian launch footage, so regrettably I'll just have to show placeholder footage here instead. The payload was Europe's Proba 3 mission, a dual satellite technology demonstration mission to investigate high-precision formation flying in order to achieve scientific coronagraphy. In English, both satellites will operate in a highly elliptical orbit, with one satellite precisely positioned to block out the sun's light from the telescope of the other satellite, allowing it to image the faint solar corona in visible, ultraviolet, and polarized light for hours at a time. There were 3 launches from China over the past week. Tuesday saw the 100th launch of the Long March 3B rocket, which carried the TJ-SW13 technology test satellite to a highly elliptical orbit, where it will, according to official sources, be used for satellite communication, radio and television, data transmission, and other related technology tests. So, bit of everything then. The following day saw the maiden flight of an upgraded version of Kuaizhou 1A, the Kuaizhou 1A probe. It carried the AirSat 08 observation satellite to a very low Earth orbit, defined as an orbital altitude below 400 kilometers, where it will operate as China's first ultra-low orbit synthetic aperture radar satellite. The Kuaizhou 1A Pro sports several upgrades over its predecessor, including a larger 1.8 meter fairing diameter and 150 kilograms of additional low Earth orbit capacity, bringing its total capacity to LEO to 450 kilograms. China's third and final launch of the week was a Long March 6A mission on Thursday, with 18 Qianfan communication satellites on board, marking the third delivery of satellites for the 14,000 satellite mega constellation Thousand Sails, designed to create a system of worldwide internet coverage, or in other words, to rival SpaceX's Starlink constellation. On Friday, the Iranian space agency launched their Sea-Moch rocket to low Earth orbit. I couldn't find a video of this launch, unfortunately, but on board was the Saman 1, a space tug developed by the Iranian space agency to an altitude of 400 kilometers, along with 2 other payloads of not quite well understood purpose. That's all I got for this one, I'm afraid. The one other launch we saw last week was from Russia's Plesetsk launch site. On the 1000th launch of the R7 rocket family, a Soyuz 2.1B carried the Cosmos 2580 signals intelligence satellite to low Earth orbit. Whew, that was a lot of orbital launches to talk about. One upcoming launch I'm very excited to cover is the maiden flight of Blue Origin's New Glenn. It is now at the pad, awaiting regulatory approval for hot fire and launch. CEO Dave Limp shared this short clip of Blue Origin's first time tanking the first stage with liquefied natural gas and liquid oxygen. I really hope we get to see this thing fly before the end of the year. In a somewhat surprising move, President-elect Donald Trump nominated Jared Isaacman as the next administrator for NASA, succeeding Bill Nelson. I was certainly not expecting this, and I think he's a pretty solid pick. And the guy clearly has an immense passion for spaceflight and NASA, and I wonder how big of a role Elon played to swing Trump's choice this way. No two ways about it, Jared is very pro SpaceX, though I think this is great news for all space launch providers. Except SLS. I would be very surprised to not see this rocket cancelled during Trump's second term. The costs are just unfathomably hard to justify at this stage. Speaking of SLS, NASA recently shared a photo of Artemis I's Orion heat shield after being removed from the crew module, being inspected inside the operations and checkout building. You can really see the scarring present, a testament to the intense heat and speeds of re-entry from lunar orbit. You can also see how some charred material broke off in several locations, something that wasn't supposed to happen. Last week, engineers announced that they had finally figured out what happened. Gases created within the heat shield's protective outer layer couldn't escape as planned, which caused pressure to build up, leading to cracks and causing some material to break off in a few spots. That was a massive oversimplification, but you get the gist. Despite this, readings from inside the capsule show that if this were a crewed mission, all the astronauts would have been fine. I'm interested to see how NASA proceeds from here regarding the Orion spacecraft for Artemis II, which will have humans on board. Laun Aerospace had another busy week last week. I not only made a video sharing some thoughts on the surprise silence break from former KSP2 creative director Nate Simpson, but I also completed a MUN mission in KSP version 0.16, a particularly old version of the game that actually predates the implementation of other planets and maneuver nodes, so it's a little harder to do MUN landings compared to today's version. If it sounds like a good time, then it should now be one of the clickable cards on screen. There's also another video from my channel there, as well as the names of my Patreon and channel supporters. If you want to support Space this week, then do consider signing up. I always do appreciate it. But other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one, which is Blunderbirds on Saturday. Get hyped, yes.